October 13th, 1944, 9:30 in the morning. A cellar on Adalbertstrasse, Aachen. The soldier's name does not appear in the American after-action reports. He is identified only by the unit designation stamped on his paybook, 246th Volksgrenadier Division, 689th Grenadier Regiment, and by the fact that he was taken prisoner on Adalbertstrasse sometime before 10 in the morning on October 13th, 1944. His interrogation record notes his age as 19, his civilian occupation as an apprentice toolmaker from Cologne, and the date he was inducted into the Wehrmacht, September 14, 1944, 29 days before his capture. He had been in the army less than a month. He had received approximately 12 days of actual infantry instruction before being assigned to defend a city against the most experienced assault division in the American Army. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the cellar and listened. The doctrine was clear. The Americans would come through the door. That was how infantry took a building. Machine gun covering the staircase, set back far enough to avoid silhouetting the gunner in the opening. Grenades stacked at the landing with pins straightened for easy pulling. One man low against the back wall with a clear angle on the threshold. Wait for the shadow in the frame. Do not fire early. Fire when the silhouette is fully committed. He had heard the artillery for 2 days before this morning. Not scattered fire, systematic dismemberment of the city's eastern perimeter. American 155mm howitzers tearing apart the railroad embankment along Aachen's eastern edge, reducing stone arch bridges and signal towers to cascading rubble. The shorter, sharper crack of tank guns working over buildings on Elsastrasse and Lagerhausstrasse. Then, sometime before 9, everything stopped. The silence was not reassuring. Artillery silence before an infantry assault was not peace, it was transition. He listened, and then the wall behind him exploded. Not the door, not the staircase, not the window with its sandbagged sill. The wall itself, the meter-thick stone wall of a house that had stood since the reign of the Holy Roman Emperors, detonated inward, and American soldiers were already inside the room before the plaster dust had reached the floor. They were not entering, they had entered. They were already shouting for him to drop his weapon, and he was complying before he had consciously decided to comply, because there was nothing in his training, nothing in his 12 days of infantry instruction, nothing in the Wehrmacht's doctrine for the defense of urban positions that had prepared him for the possibility that the wall itself was the entrance. His interrogation record was filed the same afternoon. The American intelligence officer noted in a marginal comment that the prisoner had asked the same question 3 times during the session, in different formulations, and seemed genuinely unable to resolve it. How did they know which wall? That question appears again and again in the prisoner interrogation records of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division and in the post-war accounts of German soldiers who fought at Aachen. The word that recurs most frequently is unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. The Americans seemed to know which buildings to enter before they entered them, which walls to breach before they breached them, which cellars to flood with grenades before they had ever set foot in the building above. They moved through a 1,000-year-old medieval city they had never seen before October 1944, as if the stone walls were transparent. The German garrison troops were not wrong to be confused. They were applying the doctrine of urban warfare correctly. The cellars worked. The tunnels worked, the covered doorways worked. By every measure any army understood in 1944, the defense of Aachen was sound. What the soldiers in those cellars did not yet understand was that the Americans were not playing the same game. To understand what game the Americans were actually playing, you have to go back before the battle. Back before Aachen, before the Hurtgen, before the breakout from Normandy. Back to a question that German military doctrine had never seriously asked, because the answer seemed so obvious that asking it would have been embarrassing. What happens when the attackers no longer need to come through the door? Here is what every military doctrine manual on Earth said about urban combat in 1944, regardless of which army had written it. Cities favor the defender, always, without exception. This was not a theoretical position, it was an empirical conclusion drawn from 5 years of relentlessly consistent battlefield evidence. Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful offensive formations in the history of warfare, was bled white attempting to clear a single Soviet industrial city. Warsaw. A Polish uprising held a German occupation force at bay for 63 days with fighters armed largely with captured weapons and homemade explosives. Monte Cassino. 4 separate Allied offensives were broken against a German position centered on a ruined monastery and a small Italian hill town at a cost of roughly 55,000 Allied casualties. Ortona, a single German parachute regiment held Canadian infantry, some of the best assault troops in the Allied order of battle, to a room-by-room crawl through 8 city blocks for 8 full days in December 1943. Every army in the war had learned the same lesson. 1,000 defenders in stone houses with cellars and sewers can hold a city against 10,000 attackers for weeks, at casualty ratios so favorable to the defense that any rational staff officer facing an urban assault had to ask whether the objective was worth the price. By 1944, American doctrine had absorbed this lesson at the deepest level. Operations manuals treated urban assault not as a tactical problem to be solved, but as a strategic liability to be avoided. You encircle the city, cut its supply lines, and wait. The defenders surrender when the food runs out, or you bypass the city entirely and let it wither in your rear area while your armored columns drive on. The original American plan for Aachen was exactly that: encircle, wait. That plan died on September 21, 1944, in a single order from Adolf Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler declared Aachen a Festung, a fortress city, to be held to the last man, the last shell, the last bullet. The logic was not primarily military. Aachen was the seat of Charlemagne, the city where 37 Holy Roman Emperors had been crowned in the cathedral that still dominated the medieval skyline, the first major German city the Western Allies would reach if they penetrated the Siegfried Line. Its fall would be read throughout Germany as the beginning of the end of the Reich on its own soil. It could not be permitted. The man responsible for preventing it was Colonel Gerhard Wilk, appointed garrison commander in late September 1944. Wilk was a competent professional officer with Eastern Front experience and a clear understanding of what fortified urban defense required. What he had to work with was something else entirely. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division numbered approximately 12,000 men by American intelligence estimates when reinforcements and attached units were counted. A mixture of veterans, convalescents, transferred Luftwaffe ground personnel whose aircraft no longer existed, Kriegsmarine sailors without ships, and Landesschützen from territorial defense forces who had never been expected to serve in frontline combat. Many of the infantrymen in the rifle companies had received fewer than 10 days of infantry training before being assigned to defend Aachen's medieval core. The veterans were distributed as leavening through the mass of undertrained replacements, a sergeant here who had fought at Kursk, a machine gun team whose crew chief had survived a winter on the Volga. Enough experience to establish positions competently, to sight the machine guns at angles that covered the doorways, to identify the cellars with the best tunnel connections to adjacent buildings. Not enough to know what to do when the doctrine stopped working. And on paper, those numbers should not have been enough. But Aachen was not paper. The medieval inner ring, the Innenstadt, was a labyrinth accumulating defensive advantages since the Romans. The street plan had grown organically over 15 centuries, narrowing and widening without pattern, bending around buildings that had been old when Charlemagne was young. The houses were built of dark limestone quarried from the Eifel Hills, set in walls reaching a meter in thickness in the older buildings. The cellars were the real defense, an interconnected maze of storage rooms, wine vaults, and passage tunnels built on Roman foundations, connecting multiple buildings so that a defender could enter a cellar on Adalbertstrasse, move through a connecting passage, and emerge 3 buildings away without ever appearing on the street. The factories on Aachen's eastern perimeter were worse still. K Company of the 3rd Battalion 26th Infantry Regiment, attacking on October 12th, encountered a metalworking foundry on Ulicherstrasse, where German engineers had bolted sheets of tank armor to the exterior walls. Armor removed from disabled vehicles and welded into panels that defeated both the 75mm rounds of the M4 Sherman and the shaped charges of the bazooka. The infantry had to enter without fire support, fighting through it room by room with grenades, rifles, and bayonets. The kind of fighting that, by every doctrinal calculation, should have produced casualty rates of 50% or higher. The Germans in their cellars had every reason to believe the defense would hold. Consider what the soldier on Adalbertstrasse had been told to expect. The Americans would clear the street with rifle and machine gun fire. They would pile up at the building's entrance. They would breach the door and stack at the threshold. The first man through would be silhouetted against the daylight. The machine gunner on the staircase would fire. The second American would go down in the doorway. The men on the upper floors would drop grenades down the stairwell. The men in the cellar, connected by tunnel to the adjacent building, would slip out the rear to flank the survivors. This was how Stalingrad had eaten German divisions. This was how Cassino had consumed Allied ones. The doctrine was sound. The defense was prepared. The math was correct. The men who were about to disprove that math had spent 2.5 years figuring out how to do it. The 26th Infantry Regiment, the Blue Spaders, had landed in North Africa in November 1942 and had not stopped fighting since. Tunisia, Sicily, Omaha Beach on June 6th, the Bocage of Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest. By October 1944, the regiment had cleared hundreds of German defensive positions and knew what they looked like from the inside. Its parent formation, the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had the longest continuous combat record of any American division in the European theater, 27 months by the time it reached Aachen. The division had been rebuilt through casualties and replacements so many times that in some companies the original cadre was down to 3 or 4 men. But those men carried institutional knowledge that no amount of stateside training could replicate. They knew what the doctrine said. More importantly, they knew exactly where the doctrine failed. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell M. Daniel, commanding 2nd Battalion of the 26th Infantry, was 40 years old in October 1944, West Point class of 1926. 18 years of interwar service, every campaign since North Africa. By October 1944, he was one of only 7 officers in his battalion who had been with the unit before December 1943. His battalion was at 90% replacements. The remaining 10% were the institutional memory, men who had learned in their own bodies what artillery could do to a man in the open, what a machine gun nest in a stone building cost to clear the wrong way, what the Hurtgen had done to units that moved without adequate fire support. Daniel was the man responsible for translating that knowledge into a plan that would keep the replacements alive long enough to learn it themselves. In the assembly area on the night of October 12th, he told his officers something that survived in the personal account he later submitted to the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Sweat and preparation will save 2nd Battalion blood in combat. He did not mean another weapons check. He did not mean more drill. He meant something that had, as far as the available records indicate, never been done by any battalion commander in any army to that point in the war. He was going to enter Aachen carrying granular, building-specific information about the city's defensive layout that the Germans did not believe was possible for an attacker to possess. He was going to make every building in his battalion's zone of advance a known quantity before his first riflemen crossed the railroad embankment. He took the city map, a British War Office 1 to 25,000 GSGS series base, updated with an aerial photography overlay from 1st Army, and numbered every intersection and every key building within his battalion's 2,000-yard frontage. The numbers were written in grease pencil, checked against aerial photographs, and distributed to every company commander, platoon leader, forward observer, and radio operator in his command. The system became known as the Mouseholing because the numbered dots covered the plan of the city like the rash of a childhood disease. The mechanics were simple and brutal in their efficiency. Each rifle company reported its position not by street name, German names that American radio operators routinely garbled beyond recognition, but by number. Building 47, intersection 14. A platoon leader taking fire from a third-floor window transmitted a number. That number existed as a pre-plotted target in the fire direction records of every artillery unit in range of Aachen. There were 74 such batteries. That figure appears in the after-action records of the 26th Infantry Regiment and has been verified against 1st Army operational records. It represents a concentration of firepower belonging, by every historical standard, at the level of a corps offensive. The British Expeditionary Force committed roughly this number of batteries to support an entire corps attack on the Western Front in 1917. Daniel was concentrating it on fewer than 900 men, advancing through a space 2,000 yards wide and 1,000 yards deep. The firepower was only usable because of the numbering. Without the Mouseholing map, 74 batteries were 74 separate coordination problems. Target descriptions relayed by voice radio, prone to garbling, dependent on a forward observer's ability to translate what he could see into a grid reference the gun line could use. With the measle map, the same batteries were a single, unified instrument. A building number arrived at the Fire Direction Center, was cross-referenced against the pre-plotted target list, and produced a fire mission in seconds. The artillery landed on the correct building, not the adjacent building, not the building across the intersection, with a precision that allowed American infantry 40 yards from the impact to survive. Before committing the battalion, Daniel made his men rehearse on real buildings. In the 3 days before the assault, 2nd Battalion conducted live-fire raids against German-occupied houses in the suburb of Otte-Erde. Not exercises, real buildings held by real German soldiers with real ammunition. Platoons worked through the specific tactical problems they would face inside the medieval ring. How close a tank could safely fire at a building while infantry was stacked at the adjacent corner. What remained navigable inside a building after a 155mm shell had penetrated the exterior wall. How defenders responded to simultaneous pressure from multiple approach angles. From those rehearsals came the phrase, "Knock them all down." Daniel used it first in the assembly area briefing. His company commanders repeated it to their platoon leaders. The platoon leaders repeated it to their squads. By the morning of October 13th, it had become the operational philosophy of the entire battalion, expressed in 4 words. When buildings were collapsing on the defenders could not aim. A German machine gun team in a stone position was formidable when the position was intact. The same team, buried under the ceiling of a room the M12 had just converted into rubble, was a salvage problem, not a tactical threat. What the measle map required, and what made it something more than a clever administrative system, was the information it was built on. Numbering a building was simple. Knowing what was in the building before your men entered it required a system that had been accumulating since the spring of 1944, at a facility most of the soldiers who benefited from its work had never heard of. On April 18, 1944, 5 F-5 Lightning aircraft of the 30th Photographic Reconnaissance Squadron lifted off from RAF Mount Farm in Oxfordshire. In under 1 hour, flying at 30,000 feet, they photographed 3/4 of the Netherlands, producing thousands of overlapping stereoscopic frames that would be processed and incorporated into operational planning within 72 hours. By mid-1944, the Allied Central Interpretation Unit at RAF Medmem was processing 85,000 individual frames per day. The American 10th Photographic Reconnaissance Group alone was producing weekly print volumes that, stacked, would have filled a standard freight car. Every print eventually flowed to the Aerial Photography Interpretation Detachment of the 1st United States Army, the APID. It was a small organization with a specific capability the large central facilities in England could not match. It could respond to immediate operational requirements, taking a photograph from 2 days ago and within hours producing a map overlay showing what had changed since the photograph taken 3 days before that. The APID officers were not simply identifying objects in photographs. They were conducting forensic analysis of an enemy defensive system as it evolved in real time. They could see, in successive stereoscopic prints over the same area, where a gun had moved, because the circular scrape of the traversing ring appeared in one photograph and not the next, or appeared in a new location with the old position already beginning to weather. They could identify a building converted to a defensive strongpoint by the sandbag profiles at window apertures and the absence of civilian traffic visible in earlier photographs of the same street. Each identified position was plotted on a base map with a date, the date of the photograph from which it had been derived. Not a static picture of the defense, but a dated sequence, a record of how it had changed, which positions had been reinforced, where the mobile artillery had been on September 9th, and where it had moved by September 24th. On October 4th, 1944, 8 days before the assault on Aachen's medieval core, the 654th Engineer Topographic Battalion printed the first comprehensive U.S. Army situation map of the city. The base showed every street and every block in the medieval quarter. The red overprint showed German defensive positions, each marked with the date of the most recent photographic confirmation. Anti-aircraft guns north of the cathedral, confirmed October 9th. Mobile artillery in Farwick Park, confirmed September 24th. anti-tank obstacles on Adalbertstrasse, infantry trenches across the southern approaches. Only one catalogued copy of that map is known to survive today, held in a private collection. The reason so few copies survived is straightforward. The map was so revealing of American intelligence capabilities that officers who received it were instructed to destroy their copies when they rotated out of their positions. Nobody wanted such a document to fall into German hands, into hands that would immediately understand that the Americans had been watching every adjustment to the defensive layout for weeks and dating each one to the day. But aerial photography from 30,000 feet had a limitation no interpretation system of the period could overcome. It could not see through rooftops. The map could tell an American captain that a particular apartment block on Hindenburgstrasse had a machine gun position on the second floor. It could not tell him how many rooms were on that floor, whether they connected by interior doorways, where the stairwell emerged, or whether the cellar connected to the building next door. To get those answers, the Americans needed a different kind of source, and what they got was something the Germans had left behind in their retreat. On November 2, 1944, 12 days after Aachen fell, a 46-year-old major named Floyd W. Huff made his way through the rubble of the Technische Hochschule on the city's western edge. Civil engineering degree from Cornell, wire-rimmed glasses taped together after a vehicle accident in France, receding red hair going gray at the temples. Before the war, he had led surveying expeditions in Nevada and Wyoming for the U.S. Geological Survey and spent 2 seasons charting drainage patterns in the Amazon basin for an Anglo-American oil company. He understood terrain not tactically, but geodetically, as a mathematical description of the relationship between points on the Earth's surface. He commanded a 19-man unit designated How Team, operating under blue passes signed by the G2 section of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, authorizing access to combat zones and recently captured areas without restriction from any lower headquarters. The team included a former map curator from the University of Chicago, a linguist who spoke 5 languages, and several Ritchie boys, German Jewish refugees trained in prisoner interrogation and document exploitation at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, who could read German technical documents at speed and distinguish militarily significant material from irrelevant in seconds. In the library of the Technische Hochschule, Huff found what he had traveled to Aachen to find. The German administrative staff had begun evacuating the university's most sensitive records when it became clear that Aachen would fall. Files had been assembled into folders, tied with standard German archival string, stacked on trolleys for loading onto trucks. The trucks had not come, or had come and gone before the loading was complete, or had been destroyed by American artillery en route. The folders sat in the corridor outside the library entrance, slightly damp from rain through a broken window, tied and labeled and abandoned. Inside were geodetic measurement tables of a precision Huff recognized immediately as something well beyond standard military mapping. Precise coordinates for specific points throughout German territory east of the Rhine that the Allies had not yet reached. Every road junction at which survey lines converged. Every railway crossing measured to within centimeters. Every church steeple, water tower, and hilltop triangulation station whose coordinates were already incorporated into the German artillery targeting system. How Team microfilmed the entire cache on the spot and dispatched the first rolls of film to 1st Army G2 within hours. The processed data was reaching American field artillery battalions within days. The batteries supporting infantry fighting through towns between Aachen and the Rohr River were, within a week of Huff's discovery, firing on German positions using coordinates the German army had spent years generating with its own surveying resources. The Germans had not simply lost their city. They had abandoned the cartographic foundation of every artillery engagement in their remaining defensive zone west of the Rhine, and the Americans had found it, filmed it, and put it to use before the German High Command realized what was gone. The aerial photography map revealed where the Germans were. The geodetic survey data allowed American artillery to hit those positions with extraordinary precision. The measle map gave every platoon leader the ability to call for that fire in seconds. But none of these systems could solve the fundamental problem of urban combat that had broken every army attempting to take a defended city in the previous 5 years. The problem was the door. Every building in a defended city had a limited number of entrances. Every defender knew where those entrances were. Every entrance was therefore covered by a machine gun, by a rifleman, by a grenade pre-positioned at the sound of a door handle turning. The attacker who entered through the door entered into a prepared kill zone. Stalingrad said so. Cassino said so. Ortona said so. The Americans had known this since Cassino. The question was what to do about it. The answer, in its earliest coherent form, came not from an American headquarters, but from a Canadian battalion in the narrow streets of Ortona in December 1943. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade's assault on Ortona was one of the hardest fights in the Italian campaign. The town occupied a promontory above the Adriatic, with no way around the defended buildings and no way through the German positions without taking them one at a time. The German defenders, the 1st Parachute Division, the best light infantry in the Wehrmacht, had turned every building into a fortress, every doorway into a trap. Canadian casualties in the first days reached a rate that the brigade commander compared privately to the worst days on the Western Front in 1917. The Canadians found the solution in the walls. If every doorway was a prepared killing ground and every window was covered, the only way to move from one building to the next without dying was to not use the doorways, not use the windows, not use the streets. You blew a hole through the shared wall between the building you were in and the building you needed to reach. You moved through the wall. The technique, Mouseholing, was simple in concept and lethal in execution. A sapper placed a charge against a shared interior wall, not an exterior wall exposed to German observation. The charge breached the wall. The infantry moved through. The cellar on the other side might be empty, might contain defenders without time to react, or might connect to another cellar through a passage the Germans had prepared for their own lateral movement and which could now be used by the attackers. In any case, the Germans' prepared killing ground at the doorway was bypassed entirely. American observers watching the Ortona fighting took detailed notes. Those notes, combined with lessons from Cassino and the Herkenforst villages, fed into War Department Field Manual 31-50, Attack on a Fortified Position and Combat in Towns, 124 pages, restricted distribution, published in Washington in January 1944. It was the first official American military doctrine to state plainly what the Canadians had learned in Ortona, that the streets and doorways of a defended city are death, and that the walls are not. By October 1944, when the 26th Infantry crossed the railroad embankment into Aachen, Mouseholing was no longer a Canadian improvisation. It was American doctrine. The engineers attached to Daniel's battalion carried demolitions specifically for this purpose. They did not breach doors, they breached walls, pushing holes through plaster, through brick, through the meter-thick limestone masonry of Aachen's medieval houses, creating a subterranean highway that bypassed every prepared defensive position at every doorway in the city. But beyond FM 31-50, there was something in the American arsenal the German garrison command had not encountered in its planning exercises, and had not found in any intelligence report. The M12 gun motor carriage. A 155mm M1918 long tom cannon mounted on a medium tank chassis, designed for indirect fire at targets miles away. At 300 yards with direct lay sights, used by crews who had learned to employ it as something other than what it had been designed for, it was something the German army had never seen. Daniel and Lieutenant Colonel John Corley, commanding 3rd Battalion to Daniel's north, each obtained one M12. Corley used his conventionally, direct fire against the Hotel Quellenhof, which had become a German command center, reducing its upper floors to rubble. Demolishing the courthouse on Observatory Hill after German defenders turned it into a strong point, resisting everything smaller than a 155mm round. Daniel used his differently. He had noticed in the aerial photography and ground reconnaissance that Aachen's medieval residential blocks were laid out in a characteristic pattern, rows of attached houses sharing party walls, with rows separated by narrow streets that ran perpendicular to the main avenues. Those streets were covered by German machine gun positions at the intersections and in the upper floor windows at each end of every row. An American platoon trying to cross those streets to reach the next block would be cut down before the point man reached the far sidewalk. Daniel's solution was to eliminate the street as a tactical problem. When the 2nd Battalion reached a row of attached houses where the inner block streets were impassable under German fire, The M12 pulled into position and engaged the end wall with direct fire. The shells, fitted with delayed action fuses that allowed penetration of the first wall before detonating, tore through the limestone and exploded inside the building. In the battalion's records, there are accounts of a single M12 firing 3 rounds into a row of attached houses and producing a continuous passageway through 4 buildings, a tunnel approximately 15 meters long through what had been, 3 minutes earlier, solid masonry. Where there had been a row of houses separated by load-bearing walls, there was now a single connected interior space, traversable by infantry moving at a crouch, protected from German observation and fire in the street outside, leading directly from American-controlled territory to the building on the far side of the impassable street. The Americans did not have to cross the street. The street had been made irrelevant. Now return to the cellar on Adalbertstrasse, machine gun on the staircase, grenades stacked. The soldier hears American voices in the street calling numbers he cannot understand. He hears the building above him groan. Then, not from the street side, not from outside, but from the shared wall facing the adjacent building, the wall he had not been told to watch because it was solid limestone, an explosion. American soldiers are in the room. He turns to face them. In that moment, a grenade comes down the staircase from the entry he had been watching, and through the street-side doorway that the destruction of the German covering position on the upper floor has now made enterable comes a third team. 3 directions, 3 simultaneous entry points that did not exist 10 minutes ago. A defensive plan prepared against one of those 3 directions now facing all 3. The records of G Company, 2nd Battalion, for October 18th contain one of the clearest examples. The company encountered a 3-story air raid shelter in central Aachen, reinforced concrete whose walls defeated tank fire, mortar fire, and anti-tank gun rounds. By every standard of the preceding 4 years of urban combat, a position that should have held for days. The Americans brought up a flamethrower team. They did not enter. They fired through the entrance, and within 4 minutes, 75 German soldiers and approximately 1,000 Aachen civilians who had taken shelter inside emerged through every available exit with their hands raised. The Americans never learned the interior layout of the shelter. They never needed to. There is a soldier's account that captures what this felt like from the American side of the rubble. Irvin Schwartz, a Pennsylvania private serving with the 26th Infantry Regiment's anti-tank platoon, wrote a letter to his hometown newspaper in November 1944, shortly after the battle ended. He described how his 57mm gun, designed to stop German armor, had been turned against the walls of Aachen's buildings. Not because there was armor to stop, but because the walls themselves were the obstacle. He wrote, "All the advantages of war are definitely against us, men," quoting his platoon sergeant, and described losing 3 veterans in a single afternoon to a sniper working from the ruins of what had been a downtown shopping district before the war. Old soldiers, he called them, men who had come through North Africa and Tunisia and Sicily and all of France without a scratch, gone in a city they had never heard of 6 months earlier. What Schwartz described was not failure. It was the irreducible cost of the technique even when the technique was working. Mouseholing and the measle map and the M12 did not make urban combat safe. They made it survivable at a rate that no previous urban assault in the war had achieved. The men who died on those streets died because even a system that had eliminated most of the structural advantages of the defense could not eliminate all the individual moments when a German soldier with a rifle found an angle that no amount of planning had anticipated. While Daniel's battalion was working through the central city, a different kind of fight was taking place on the high ground to the north that made the entire urban operation possible. Crucifix Hill, Lausberg, commanded the northern approaches to Aachen from an elevation of 258 meters. German engineers had spent weeks converting the hillside into a defensive complex of 43 individual pillboxes and bunkers, each positioned to cover adjacent positions, the whole forming an interlocking network that could not be neutralized by attacking any single element in isolation. The 18th Infantry Regiment's C Company was assigned to take the hill on October 8th. Its commander was Captain Robert Evan Brown, Jr. Brown had enlisted in the United States Army in 1918 at the age of 15, falsifying his birth date on the enlistment form. He had spent the interwar years accumulating technical knowledge at the pace peacetime service permitted. He had received a battlefield commission in North Africa. He had assumed command of C Company on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, when his company commander was killed in the first minutes of the landing. By October 1944, he had 26 years of service and a competence in infantry tactics that could only come from spending more than 2 decades thinking about nothing else. His Medal of Honor citation describes October 8th in the language official Army documents use: precise, passive, stripped of the disorder the events it describes must have contained. He obtained a pole charge. He started forward alone. He crawled and ran under fire across 100 yards of open ground to the aperture of the first pillbox. He inserted the charge and withdrew. The pillbox detonated with its occupants inside. He was struck by mortar fragments. He refused medical attention. He moved to the second pillbox. He destroyed it the same way, then a third. He then conducted a personal reconnaissance of the reverse slope, alone, on foot, in daylight, deliberately drawing fire to his position so that the muzzle flashes and tracer paths of German weapons would reveal their locations to American observers. He was hit twice more. He returned with information that allowed his company to defeat 2 German counterattacks that afternoon. Only when the position was secured did he submit to treatment for his 3 wounds. He was wounded 13 times before the war ended. After his discharge, Robert Brown worked as a janitor at the United States Military Academy at West Point, the institution that had trained the officers he had served under for 26 years. He died by his own hand in a Florida apartment in 1971. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The hill Brown's company took on October 8th closed the northern arm of the encirclement ring around Aachen. The ring meant no resupply, no reinforcement, no lateral communication with German forces outside the city. Wilk's command was operating in a closed system, consuming ammunition and medical supplies that could not be replaced, suffering casualties that could not be evacuated, watching the defensive perimeter contract every day without the ability to call on anything beyond what was already inside the ring. It was the ring that made Daniel's measle map a practical instrument of war rather than an elaborate planning exercise. Without the ring, the German garrison could have rotated exhausted units out of positions the measle map was systematically targeting, bringing fresh troops in after the Americans had expended their fire on the previous occupants. With the ring, every German soldier who walked away from a collapsed building into the cellar of the next one was making a withdrawal from a finite account that could not be replenished. The 116th Panzer Division and the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division, 23,300 men, more than 100 tracked vehicles, had attempted to break through the encirclement ring from the outside and relieve the garrison. American air power destroyed more than 100 of their vehicles before they reached the city. The ring held. On October 21, 1944, at 5 minutes past noon, Brigadier General George A. Taylor, Assistant Commander of the 1st Infantry Division, accepted the surrender of Colonel Wilk and the German garrison of Aachen, the first major city on internationally recognized German soil to fall to the Western Allies. The bill, in the language of after-action reports. The 26th Infantry Regiment suffered 498 casualties from all causes during the operation inside the city. Daniel's 2nd Battalion alone suffered fewer than 100. The 1st Infantry Division as a whole, from the start of operations on October 2nd, had taken 150 killed and approximately 1,100 wounded. The 30th Infantry Division, fighting the encirclement to the north, suffered around 3,000 killed and wounded. American casualties across the entire battle, over 7,000. Heavy, but not the bloodbath that urban warfare doctrine had predicted. The German bill was different. The 26th Infantry Regiment alone took 5,737 prisoners, including 3,473 inside the city. 2 German divisions destroyed, 8 more badly damaged. By the end, 85% of Aachen was rubble. The surrender itself is documented in detail that the summary histories tend to omit. Wilk did not emerge willingly. Lieutenant Colonel Corley presented him with an ultimatum in the final bunker on Lausbergstrasse. Surrender, or the destruction of what remained of the city would continue. Wilk initially refused to sign the surrender declaration, telling Corley through an interpreter that he feared what the German government would do to his family. Corley poured him a glass of whiskey. Wilk refused again. After the 3rd glass, he signed. The German troops walked out of Aachen in long columns of 4, A correspondent from the Associated Press who was present wrote that when the last of the German troops had been secured in prisoner cages outside the city, Wilkes' stern Prussian composure crumbled, and he wept, his shoulders shaking with convulsive sobs. Within days, the German propaganda apparatus produced a leaflet featuring Wilkes' photograph under the headline, "He Bears the Guilt," blaming him for the destruction of Aachen and accusing him of surrendering to finish the war in personal safety. He was held at the Trent Park officer prisoner camp in England until March 1945. He died in Rheinbreitbach, West Germany, in 1985, 40 years after the battle, having outlived most of the men on both sides who had fought under his command. Wilkes had ordered his men to fight to the last man, the last shell, the last bullet. Most of them did not. Most of them came out of their cellars when the buildings above them collapsed, and walked toward the American lines with their hands over their heads. Why did Aachen fall in 9 days? It was not because the Germans were poor soldiers. Many were inexperienced, half conscripts and convalescents, but they fought hard, and the veterans among them fought brilliantly. It was not because the Americans had a superiority of numbers. The 26th Infantry Regiment committed roughly 2,000 men to the assault of a city the Americans believed was defended by nearly 12,000. It was because the Germans were applying a doctrine the Americans had quietly abandoned. The Germans believed urban combat was a contest between defenders who knew the buildings and attackers who did not. The Americans had decided, in the long, bitter education of Cassino and Ortona and the Hurtgen, that the contest itself could be redefined. They had assembled 3 systems that no other army on Earth had put together in a single operational framework. Aerial photography that exposed German defensive positions day by day, dated to the photograph, plotted on a map distributed before the assault began. A numbering system that converted every building in the city into a coordinate. Any platoon leader could transmit to 74 artillery batteries in under 10 seconds. A demolition technique, augmented by a self-propelled 155mm gun used at 300 yards, that converted every wall into a doorway and every sealed building into an open one. Together, those systems produced the effect that garrison troops described again and again with the same word, unbegreiflich. And here is the deepest part of the answer, the part that emerged only when Floyd Huff and Howe team walked through the rubble of the captured city in November and found, in the abandoned folders outside the university library, the geodetic survey data the Germans had left behind. Precise coordinates of every road, every railway junction, every elevation point in territory the Allies had not yet reached. Microfilmed on the spot, forwarded within hours. Used that same week by the batteries firing in support of infantry advancing toward the Rhine. The Germans had not just lost their city, they had surrendered the cartographic foundation of everything standing between Aachen and Berlin. They kept asking how the Americans had read their rooms. They never arrived at the question they should have asked, the question that, had they asked it in 1942 rather than 1944, might have produced a different answer. At what point did the Americans stop fighting cities the way cities had always been fought, and start treating them as a problem of information? With every tool of an industrial civilization brought to bear at a tactical scale no other army on Earth had imagined. The answer, traced backward through the records, lies somewhere between Tunisia in 1943 and the Italian winter of 1944. Somewhere in the fighting at Cassino, where American infantry first understood that doorways were death. Somewhere in the 124 pages of FM 31-50. Somewhere in the mind of Lieutenant Colonel Darrell M. Daniel the night before October 13th, sitting with a city map and a colored pencil. In the cellar on Adalbertstrasse, the dust is still settling. The Volksgrenadier is on his knees, hands behind his head. The wall that was a wall is now a doorway. The American sergeant standing in the new opening does not pause to study the room. He has already passed through it. He is already moving on to the next.